So this is what we're going to focus on today is, from Mark and I's perspective, working with the market, helping our clients, adjust to GDPR. Obviously, now the regulation is in effect. So where are we today? We have put together for you today 10 kind of lessons, right, of post-GDPR. So we'll run through each of those, kind of provide commentary, and then hopefully have some time for questions around this as well. So the first one that we wanted to talk about is really that it's not just about GDPR now, right? We're starting to see a lot of movement with privacy regulations becoming a global change, right? So we have GDPR, of course, as a catalyst for a lot of businesses getting organized, getting their privacy programs up and running and in order. But now we have, Brazil coming to the table. Of course, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act, which we're watching very closely, right? As well as India's privacy bill, among others. So we're really seeing a shift into global privacy there. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, so, I think as a European, I've been working in Silicon Valley the last 4 years and had some time out here in the early 2000s. And the one thing that I can really draw a comparison, so I arrived in Silicon Valley just after .com and many businesses fleeing and struggling. And at that point, I tried to talk about European privacy as I knew what European privacy was, and I couldn't get into any dialogue. I certainly wouldn't be talking up on a stage to talk about European privacy 15 years ago. The one thing GDPR has done, and now these other laws, is it's changed the global mentality around what privacy means and the importance of privacy. And I think one of the big takeaways from working as a lawyer out here in Silicon Valley is just how much importance businesses have attached to privacy generally, but also European privacy and what the GDPR has meant to their business. Now, as Stephanie says, we're beginning to see these copycat laws, which are really pulling us in a number of directions. We used to have the occasional question about Russia, but now we're not only are we talking about the 28 member states plus the 3 in the EEA, we're also looking globally at other challenges and other issues, and potentially issues where we're going to be fighting more and more against potential sort of jurisdictional challenges. Ireland wants me to do this, but Russia wants me to do that. We talked this morning about the potential for China, Russia, and India having different localization laws, which all require the same thing of companies, but they can't comply with all of them because they all say something slightly different. And I think the future will hold some real issues for us on that, Stephanie. So.
Agreed. So stay tuned there. So the second note, on GDPR that we did want to talk about is that GDPR has really become a prerequisite for B2B businesses now, right? For doing business with other companies, you really need to understand the full chain of all of your processors, sub-processors, basically all the vendors that you're working with, right? Up and down. So it's really changed, I think, the landscape of contract negotiation, right? Handling data protection has become a really big topic in B2B markets, and it's really actually a very important revelation, I think, for anyone that does business that starts to touch the EU. Even if you're not directly in scope or affected by GDPR, we are seeing that a lot of folks are having this impact of the data regulation and data privacy implications on their contracting processes coming up as well.
Yeah, very much so. And the impact is significant. And the way Europe sees privacy in a very sort of binary way, you're either a data controller deciding how to collect and use information, or you're a data processor processing that information on behalf of someone else. I think there's a general assumption that most businesses out here in Silicon Valley are just trying to gather data, hoover it up, and use it. And of course, there's a lot of good application of big data. But actually, a lot of businesses in Silicon Valley, particularly, are processing that data on behalf of others. So they've effectively had to come up with a trust equation which gets them over the line in terms of European sales. So GDPR has been part of their conversation almost for longer than a number of other businesses. And we saw that. I sit in a privacy team which spans Europe. We've got around 60 individuals practicing privacy and 10 out here in the US. But for a long time in the US, we were ahead of the game in terms of the work we were doing and the kind of issues we were thinking about, because actually US businesses were tackling GDPR ahead of their compatriots in Europe, and with a different kind of attitude and an important attitude, because they knew that if they didn't get that right, they would lose business or they would lose opportunity on the global stage. So, and I think we'll definitely see a lot more of that. So,
absolutely. So the third piece we wanted to talk about, and we wanted to talk about this early on in our conversation today on GDPR, is really the current state of enforcement and really the regulatory approach. And prior to the GDPR going into effect, we had the Article 29 Working Party, now the European Data Protection Board, providing guidance on, how to interpret the regulation. And there's still a lot of discussion out there. We will see how the regulation gets enforced and really what comes into effect here, learning from the enforcement of the regulation. And I think, from where we sit today in, September, it's only been, a few months. And of course, we've seen lots of things like breach notifications, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but we really have not yet seen, a lot of additional guidance, a lot in the form of enforcement. So still a lot of gray there, and I think there's still a lot of folks that are kind of waiting in the wings to sort of see how things play out in this post-enforcement world.
Absolutely. And, a lot of grey. And I think, we could sit here in 6 years' time and still talk about a lot of grey and uncertainty, because, a lot of the GDPR is quite an aspirational law, and it'll take a long time for businesses to really understand and get on top of it. So there is real interest in enforcement. Of course, the big stick that was wielded from Europe was these, the fines of 20 million euros or 4% of worldwide turnover, whichever is the greater. That got people thinking. That links back to our previous point on B2B sales. That's why businesses wanted to get ready. That's one of the reasons they were interested in complying, was because of that enforcement. But also for some, going back to that trust equation, some of those businesses had to comply because it was their customers that were fearing that kind of enforcement. So we really are watching to see how the enforcement pans out, and also where we get other guidance and other explanations to fill in around some of this grey, so we understand the direction of travel and understand what really matters. Because as with all laws, there's always some areas of the law that count a little bit more than others, but right now it's a little bit of crystal ball to work out where we should really focus and where we shouldn't. So,
yeah, and I think that's the perfect segue, Mark, into our next point, which is some areas of the regulation are receiving more action and attention, than others, right? So you look at the regulation, of course, you've got your data protection agreements, everyone's taking those pretty seriously. But then you look at, your DPO appointments and maybe not, right? So what you see is this sort of uncertainty in terms of how do you, operationalize approaching the regulation and taking that into account, and where do you start? And is there, maybe certain areas where you don't have to go to 100% because you are waiting on that regulatory action or enforcement to come in to really tell you? Because, the regulation and complying with the regulation, it can be a big burden on these organizations, right? And we're not exactly making money off of complying here. We're sort of protecting ourselves, right, for fear of the teeth of the regulation and the fines. So we have seen some interesting things, I would say, in working with our customers and seeing folks adopt their readiness here in terms of what they're paying attention to today and what they might still be kind of waiting on the sidelines to really get done.
Yeah, I think what they pay attention to today is often economic measures. So if you are a business that's primarily a processor targeting customers, you had to do enough to get ready for those customers. Again, kind of loops us back to one of those other points. But also geography. One of the things the GDPR did was purports to have extraterritorial effect. So you can be a startup doing analytics in San Francisco, have no European footprint, but because of the way those rules are drafted, the GDPR still technically applies to you if you're targeting your goods and services, or if you're monitoring, or engaging in monitoring or tracking of individuals in Europe. So Europe really wanted the rules to spread. And because of that, some businesses have found they're having to comply. There's future debate to say, does that startup in San Francisco have the same kind of exposure as that same startup would do in Milan? That's one of the things we have to see, because you can't come get them. But we'll see those rules changing and mattering in a different way over time. We've seen it in the past. One of the big changes for Silicon Valley around rules changes that count was the fall of safe harbor and the way a number of US businesses got their data to Europe, from Europe to the US. Of course, that data transfer was restricted, but safe harbor falling away, coupled with the revelations from Edward Snowden at that point, really meant the US had to look at data in a different way. It looked at the way it transferred data in a different way, and that's almost the sort of sea change in the career of the privacy lawyer out here. We all look back to Max Strem's, that little, not little, but that student from Austria that was just spending time in Santa Clara University down the road, who suddenly realized, my data is being processed in the US by Facebook, and what can I do about it? And what can I do about it probably brings you on to the next point, Stephanie.
Yeah, there we go. So we do anticipate, seeing quite a bit of regulatory reports coming in. Already in the first month after GDPR, we saw quite a few, and some of that does stem from the uncertainty and the fear, right? And also this new 72-hour window on our incident reporting. So we are seeing, quite a few incident reports get filed already, and really the lesson there is this is a great place to really have your ducks in a row, is what I would say. Know what you need to do, because that can be a really stressful time period, and it's a very short window. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that folks are so unclear on whether they should or shouldn't report, and they're really reporting a lot right now. So we see a lot of those coming in. Now, also worth noting that whether you're reporting or not, this is also a great area to just stay organized and document. I think we see a lot of folks working towards documenting, even if you're not going to report, documenting why you decided not to report, right? And really having that in place so that you are, buttoned up should anyone come asking and looking for things like that. But I have a couple stats. I think Ireland received 547 data breach notifications and 386 complaints in the first month. And the UK, over 1,100 complaints in the first month as well, with France, a 50% year-over-year increase in the number of complaints in the first month. So we're definitely seeing, a lot of those reports to the regulators, and we think that will continue as well.
It will also overload because the regulators can't currently cope with it. Another fun fact, the week of 25th of May when the GDPR became applicable, GDPR was trending in Google more than Beyonce. So it definitely focused people's mind. And the part of that focus around the number of regulatory reports is also coming from the fact our next prediction around data subjects. Because one of the things GDPR has done is it's enforced, it's introduced new rights and enhanced the rights of individuals. And the publicity that GDPR has got, and the fact that people were out there Googling GDPR, has led individuals to realize they have rights, and individuals to realize they can act if they feel businesses are abusing their data or doing things with the data that they don't want. So we're seeing a real trend in those kind of requests coming in, more than we ever predicted prior to the GDPR, more than a lot of businesses wanted to deal with, and having some kind of systematic process and tools to do that is to deal with those kind of rights is important. Is that, so what are you saying there?
Absolutely, Mark. I would completely agree with that. I would add to that you're not allowed to charge for actually actioning these requests, right? So this is a great area for, as Mark said, coming up with a process and understanding, where this data is. Look, the spirit of this is good, right? It's really asking you to know what it is you're doing with this data, where it's stored, and giving folks that transparency, right, and the knowledge of that. So if you look at it from that light and, treat it as, hey, this is good, we should be communicating these requests. And one of the topics that came up this morning in our workshop on this was, companies are respecting these rights even for consumers that are outside of the EU today. And this is a big part of the California Consumer Privacy Act as well, is, you know, having these rights within California as a resident of California. So really interesting to see if this creates a wave where, you know, myself as a resident of Atlanta, Georgia, you know, are the companies in California going to respect my right here? Do they need to? No. But are they going to adopt that and give me that transparency as well? Will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another great European export success, data rights. And as I fled London for San Francisco and Palo Alto, I'm glad that I got some rights following me, because they're good for society, and I think they just got to, you know, be something that businesses are going to have to live with, and then we'll look to support, because they're inherent rights, they're fundamental rights, and I think, you know, the majority would support seeing them, you know, exercised, as long as they're not abused, as we touched on this morning. But why don't you talk about the haunting prospect of another law as bad as GDPR?
So the EPrivacy regulation, which is set to you know, replace the directive that exists today, is you know, still something that we're waiting on to be finalized. Also a topic in our session this morning of when we might see that coming out. So, you know, with EPrivacy, this really has the potential to change the landscape of a lot of direct marketing, as well as how we actually leverage technology. You know, so in Silicon Valley, I think really important to keep up with EPrivacy and what could potentially be coming here as we look for the regulation to come out, often referenced as, you know, the cookie law. If you've seen the cookie banners popping up all over the web and harassing you for your consent, you know, this is where all of that starts to come in. And this will potentially, you know, has the opportunity to create a really drastic change for businesses. So I would say if you're not as familiar with the privacy landscape, you definitely want to set your, you know, Google alerts for ePrivacy so that you can keep up with what's coming out there.
Absolutely. So anyone interested in the confidentiality of their communications, anyone interested in, as Stephanie was saying, cookies, the equivalence of canned spam, the way you can market to individuals. You know, every business on this planet markets and promotes what they're doing. Every business in Europe or with European data is going to be interested in what ePrivacy says about how they can go and use that data. And, you know, talking about we'll have to look at the law today, reading into prior law, but we're also going to look at future law. And one of the concerns I've got looking into the future is that we could end up with this kind of either uncertainty that this law that's promised will take a lot longer to come along, or we could, you know, worse still, end up with, you know, fatigue. I mean, effectively, come on, this is privacy law. It's not exactly the most electrifying, you know, thing to spend your day on. But it's going to be, you know, if people get bored or businesses can't deal with it or can't, you know, maintain the momentum internally to deal with these issues, then certain individuals in Europe are going to be failed. So getting some certainty is one of the things that came out of our discussions this morning. Just understanding, okay, what is ePrivacy going to do? When is it going to do that? And what will it mean for my business, so I can start to prepare for that?
Yeah. All right, so a couple more here to wrap up. The next one is really looking at technical standards and for marketing and beyond, right? So thinking about having standards that can help us kind of harmonize across this world of regulation, right? So certainly we are waiting on some different codes of conduct and certifications that are promised by the GDPR that we're waiting to be approved. But we have seen some traction with other standards being adopted, even things like looking at, you know, ISO certifications or SOC 2 Type 2s being adopted to make things like vendor relationships easier to navigate. Or if you're familiar with the advertising space, the IAB Europe's advertising framework that they've put together for consent capture to make that cookie banner process easier to serve up targeted ads. So really we're seeing, you know, some development of continued standards here, and that's really meant to help everyone comply in an easier way. I think there's always an interesting discussion around where standards and innovation come together, right? Where standards leave room for innovation. So certainly we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But I think this in general is a really great direction, right, to provide a lot of standards, and we're still awaiting, as we said, those certifications.
We are, and just moving beyond, just to bring in one of the conversations this morning, and our colleagues from the Commission that are here today were sort of, they were pointing out that actually the GDPR is, it's in some way helpful because it's a principle-based piece of legislation. It talks about, say, appropriate security, but doesn't dictate what appropriate security is. It leaves it up to business to make that decision. One of the challenges that came from the Commission representative this morning was, what if we'd done that and we'd had a rules-based system? What if we told you what to do? To some extent, the GDPR does have some flexibility if you understand it. And it's been designed, one, to be there for the next 20 years. And it's designed, two, to apply not only to children's data, not only to health data, to financial data, to all data which may be personal. And that's one of the challenges. You've got to spend a bit of time picking through it and setting your own standards. Or, again, as Soren from the European Parliament pointed out, getting together and talking to each other, finding your own solutions to do this. And I think that's one of the things that came out of the discussions this morning. It's good to help solve some of these solutions in a community, which is just the sort of thing that we're trying to do. So.
All right, so next we have really the challenge of genuine privacy expertise out there in the market. So we're seeing this creation of all of these jobs and this opportunity for individuals that understand privacy and privacy law, and we don't quite have enough trained people to fill all these roles, right? So we're starting to see, a lot of education in the privacy space, but really there is a huge opportunity here, right, for individuals within an organization, even within a role of, everything from a CISO to a CMO, even to, of course, counsel, as having opportunity to really become educated in the privacy space and to incorporate that into the way that you operate your businesses today, right?
I mean, absolutely. And education, because there aren't enough people, but also embracing tools. And, Stephanie's here from a business, OneTrust, who started, 3 years ago, and now it's sort of 500, 450 people. Yeah, just on the back of GDPR privacy and solving businesses' needs around technology and tools which help accountability, help with cookies. So there are opportunities within that for individuals coming into the space. There's, desperate list of clients that we're working with that are looking for data protection officers or new resources or new people to take up the roles. So bringing that training, bringing that role in. If you meet someone who says they've been in privacy 10 years, chances are they're lying to you because you couldn't fill your day with privacy 10 years ago, or at least very few people could fill their day. So yeah, that's one of our big predictions is this is going to be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for advisors, for those in the know, but also for those providing tools and solutions for business that help this kind of compliance. So,
absolutely. And then our last point today to wrap up is around our potential for an international data transfer meltdown. So, Mark, I might let you take this one because I know you're pretty excited about
So, and this is partly comes from experience. So, October 2016, Max Schrems took Facebook to court. European Court of Justice brought down the the safe harbor scheme for moving data to Europe overnight. Big ramifications, as I mentioned earlier, everyone started looking at data and how they transfer the data. That was probably the most significant thing that happened in the US to European data and in the build-up to GDPR. But we're still in a situation where we have the GDPR now, and in order to protect those individual rights and in order to protect data, the GDPR is designed in a way that the law follows that data so it continues to be protected in the US. It doesn't say it has to stay in Europe. It says it has to be protected if it leaves Europe in an adequate way. And at the moment, we have very few choices to move that data, essentially 3. One of those isn't accessible for the bigger companies. And we have 2 regimes, the Privacy Shield and model clauses, both of which have some questions around them, because either they're up for challenge in the courts in the case of the model clauses, or there's some doubt about how so robust they are. And the European Parliament actually took a sort of symbolic vote earlier in the summer against Privacy Shield to kind of bring that down. So we're working with businesses to make sure they've got more than one plan, a plan B for moving data, but actually having a plan C and a plan D and a plan E would be useful if there were other solutions out there. So I think we all look ahead, see those court cases coming, and realize we could actually be having another kind of October meltdown where there's nothing but international transfers talked about for a few months to come. Let's hope not, but certainly keep an eye on that, and keep an eye on the ability of businesses to move data, and just think about the political fallout and the economic fallout, because data is the new oil, data is trade. If I can't trade and I can't use that data, there's going to be an incredible impact to most people in this room if you're interested in the US and you're also interested in the EU and doing more together and more closer unity. So.
Yeah, and just to add some color to that, if you're not familiar with the privacy space, just think about an international organization that's consolidated their CRM instance in the US, right? One single instance of our CRM, we're going to funnel all of our data into that, and now, all of a sudden, you can't transfer any of your leads or contacts to your CRM that you've centralized in the US. So if you're not familiar with these concepts, those are the types of stories, the types of examples to just give you some insight into what's stressing your colleagues out about this topic. So that's a little bit on...
Absolutely, and that reflects our discussions this morning. Thank you for those of you who came and contributed, and for the opportunity to contribute and advance some of those discussions in this little bubble of privacy. So thanks for listening. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah.